Good morning, everyone. I'm very, very pleased to be with you today. I think we've got a fantastic panel and with a very big diversity of point of view. We'd like to discuss net zero today, in particular in the current environment. A lot of geopolitical tensions, obviously, but also other things happening. You've heard about all the greenwashing allegations touching a number of investors. Is this affecting the agenda, or actually are we on a more kind of a longer-term journey that every stakeholders here are going to speak about? We'd like to speak about the UK, obviously, but also what's happening to the green finance agenda and the net zero agenda in the current context abroad, and how the UK actually could contribute to it. We would like this session, I think, to be very interactive if possible. So we would really welcome some questions from the audience. You can send some questions and we'll look at the iPad, or simply raise your hand. And that would be probably the most efficient way, actually. We'd like to get a sense of the tone, what you think about these issues as well, and so that we can feed some responses here. You will see there will be a poll with one question, and we'll come back to it towards the end and see whether this session has highlighted some of the maybe the questions you may have. So maybe to start with, I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists. Myself, I'm engaging with clients, key clients on transition. So it's quite interesting right now because we see a variety of those situations. We recently run a research conference, actually, where we had very different perspectives from the corporate world and from the investor base. As a matter of fact, corporates were quite optimistic that they could deliver net zero targets in this very confusing and difficult agenda, and quite optimistic. After COVID-19, they said basically that a lot of people have been saving in Europe in particular, and they would be in a position to absorb some of the shocks that we are seeing. I think investors were much more cautious, much more worried about how to put their money to work and to support the agenda. But I think that shows, you know, that there are lots of different perspectives that we need to talk about. Can I perhaps introduce each and every of you? Very shortly, but then we'll take on. Bryony, can I start with you? So you have 15 years of experience in financial markets. I think you can really help us today to give us some perspective precisely on greenwashing, and also given your range of experience in alternative credit, structured finance, fund finance, tech-enabled finance. Please, you know, step in. Noeleen, you're a finance and fintech lawyer. So if you could, and you are leading KPMG's UK financial services risk and regulation driven transformation practice. I think your point of view is going to be really, really interesting. Simon, obviously, everyone knows Simon in the UK as Global Head of Sustainability Strategy for at Standard Chartered. If you could give us the perspective of the banking world, what you see, and also obviously in your role as chair of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, if you could give us some perspective. And Joseph, working at Willis Towers Watson, you led engagement with financial institutions, and prior to joining WTW, you worked at the G20 Financial Stability Board, so that's going to be also quite interesting in terms of perspective to this current debate. So I went through the admin. Maybe we're going to launch the polling question. I don't know if it's going to appear on your screen, but we're going to ask you at the beginning of this session, what are the two main barriers to action giving rise to legal compliance risk for financial service firms, getting involved with green ESG financial products. So if you could please answer the poll. I do not know if it's an immediate answer or if you want to answer throughout the session, but please, answer the poll. There are a couple of offered answers. Yes, here you go. I think we'll comment on the poll results maybe at the end of the session, because you may change your answer as we speak. So let's kick off, and I'll start with Joe. Obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to skyrocketing energy prices. And there are some talks that some governments are seemingly rowing back on net zero commitments. Should we be pessimistic, Joe?
I try never to be pessimistic. I try to be an optimist, but I think I'm a more cautious optimist, Delphine, than I was 6 months ago, 5 months ago. We've just emerged from this extraordinary 10 years economically, right, where interest rates were rock bottom, growth was reasonably steady, inflation was low, the perfect environment to invest in long-term sustainable energy products, right? But we lack the political will and drivers to do so. Now we have the political will bit sorted, and governments are talking about it, the Shadow Chancellor's on stage talking about it, but interest rates are rocketing, growth's faltering, energy prices are sky high, we have a cost of living crisis, etc. I don't know if anyone remembers the sci-fi film, The Matrix, from the late 90s. It made a big impression on me. I was a teenager then. First time I was allowed to go to the movies alone, I don't know. And there's that moment where Neo has to choose between the blue pill and the red pill, right? So we can take the blue pill, live in blissful ignorance, denial, or the red pill, he has to confront this sort of harsh reality. It's very unsettling. He has to confront his demons and do something about them. That's kind of the choice that governments face at the moment, right? And the risk is that they choose the blue pill and say, well, can't we just delay transition for 2 to 5 years? Let's just import liquid natural gas from the US to solve and bring down energy prices. Or do they take the red pill and confront this harsh reality and say, right, now is the moment to really encourage and create the right regulatory environment for investment in sustainable finance projects and in renewable energy. And I think there's plenty of evidence for pessimism, right? Because rising gas prices have, for example, coincided with a huge increase in the use of coal as a source of power. Greenhouse gas emissions have sprung back in the last 2 years, post-COVID. And let's face it, the red pill is really hard for governments to swallow, right? Because you see the benefits. You have to pay for investment in renewable energy today, but you don't see the benefits for another 10, 20, maybe 25 years. Now, luckily, we have a way of solving that, what the central bank governor Mark Carney used to call the tragedy of horizons, right? The financial system is the plumbing through which patience should be rewarded, right? You can take long-term pools of capital and the financial system can plumb them into and ensure that they are invested in profitable, renewable energy projects. And that should give us cause for optimism, right? Higher returns should reward investor patience. I think the big question, the question I hope we come on to in this panel, is how can we make sure that financial markets and financial institutions are that source for good, that the plumbing works well, and that we get the capital and the cash into the places where we need it, so that we can all be optimists.
Thank you. So that leads me naturally to a question to Simon, actually as co-chair of the Net Zero Banking Alliance banks. Can you give us a bit of perspective on what they have been doing, how they have been progressing on these net zero commitments? And also, if you could also touch upon a little bit on what they see from their clients.
Of course. Thank you, Delphine. So, for those who don't know, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which is convened by the UN, but it's very much bank-led, was established last April, in April 2021. It's just over a year old, therefore, and it's grown really quite rapidly. We now, as of the last count, have 113 banks as our members, 41 markets or countries across the globe from which those banks hail, and around 38% of global banking sector assets. That's fantastic. But they've signed a piece of paper at this stage. You know, they've said, okay, we're going to get on board the net zero bus. And so the work the Net Zero Banking Alliance has to do is to help them plot the journey that bus is going to travel on, to help them understand actually how do they bring that into their daily practice within their own organisations. And I'd say that, you know, if I think about it from Standard Chartered's perspective, we invested a significant amount of financial and human capital in the place we've got to on our own net zero journey and the plans that we have and the way that we're bringing those into the organisation. Some of that is necessary because it's specific to the business models of every bank, which are different, but some of it is shared endeavours. And so through the work streams, we've got one on implementation, we've got some sector tracks looking at how you work with clients in specific sectors, is to try and make this manageable for those 113 banks that are around the table. And just as importantly, to try and attract more banks, in particular from emerging markets, to come in and to minimise the burden of operationalisation for net zero. And so I think that's working, and it is bringing the banks to the table. It's also bringing the banks to the table with their clients and recognising that we all sit within another acronym here, but the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which Mark Carney helps run, GFANS, which is the Pan Financial Services platform. But banks have a specific role here. You know, we can bring specific types of financing down to the asset level and therefore help support that transition. And I think it is a transition. It's one that requires really careful, thoughtful planning, but a lot of agility in execution, as the conflict in Ukraine is showing. Geopolitical realities will always come and intervene. And one of the things that we're grappling with in the implementation working group is around scenarios and use of scenarios, because there are an economically optimized, idealistic situation. I can't emphasize enough how helpful the IEA Net Zero 2050 scenario has been, because back when financial institutions and corporates first started making net zero commitments, there was no scenario. And therefore you were all saying, okay, we commit to this thing, but it's a little bit of a blank check because no one knew quite what it looked like. And so the IEA makes that more tractable, more understandable. But like a map versus walking the territory, it's never going to be the same. And I think the most important thing that we need to bear in mind is where, as a result of geopolitical uncertainties, we make trade-offs that deviate from the IEA's policy recommendations. It's a little bit like pushing in a balloon here. The air's going to come out somewhere else. So you have to adapt. You have to be more stringent in some areas if you're choosing to be less stringent at a national or a regional or a global level. And in that, therefore, for at least from my perspective, if we think about the conflict, we're seeing, and I think these have just been laid out really well, but we're seeing two key things. We're seeing one is inflation is driving up the cost of capital. It's getting more expensive to do stuff. And at the same time, we're seeing the cost of energy increasing, and therefore we're seeing less room to manoeuvre. And the real tragedy, in my perspective, if we come back to the transition needing to be planned in a systematic way but executed in an agile way, is if the burden were to fall as continued OPEX, continued management of higher energy costs, rather than being translated into CAPEX to actually drive that transition. And that's what we need to do as the financial services sector, as the banking sector, and then as individual banks working with clients within that NZBA framework.
Thank you, Simon. So as a bank, obviously, when you work on your net zero journey, you're working on different scope, as we say, scope 1, 2, and 3, and the biggest scope for a bank is its lending book and its clients, basically, so trying to shift and make them transition. In doing that, there is another risk which has come up. Everyone talks about it, greenwashing, but we have to navigate that one as well. So far, to my knowledge, there is nothing else than the finance sector to be as best placed to try to finance precisely these gaps together with stakeholders. So how actually can we face that risk? Do you see it as something which could be slowing down processes, Bryony?
Yes. Obviously, greenwashing is really high on the agenda, both from a sort of media perspective as well as from the commercial perspective and the legal perspective as well. And in trying to frame and create ESG financial products and investments, there's obviously that key risk that the ultimate outcomes fall short of purpose. And there's a trust problem around this. And Simon was just mentioning, agility in execution of this policy. And there's a challenge around being agile and being able to be reactive to current existing circumstances, whilst maintaining trust in a sufficient underlying commitment to the intended purpose of both a policy and on a product level. And obviously these products and investments are being developed in a competitive and very sort of public arena. So, you know, the public claims about characteristics turning out to have not be associated with the ultimate outcomes is exposing businesses across the financial services sector to multiple potential bases of liability. I don't need to go through any names, but we've had, you know, BaFin raiding businesses. We've had the SEC, you know, making investigations. We're probably teetering on the brink of some kind of situation in the UK with the FCA as well. There's very, very strong media interest. And I think what Simon mentioned about GFANZ, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, there was an article in the UK papers about, you know, loopholes, about GFANZ members exploiting loopholes in policy to enable them to continue fueling fossil fuels beyond the science-based pathways to 1.5 degrees to net zero, because of the need for agility in the context of circumstances. And so it's this balance, you know, and how can businesses who want to develop and sell ESG financial products, which ultimately ought to be really very, very useful in the context of the levers that you were talking about, you know, trying to lever the real economy towards transition and towards net zero. How can they do that in an appropriately risk mitigated way? You know, that's something that we're obviously working really closely with clients on, identifying some of the key traps around the development and offering and sale of these types of products, and then working with them to create frameworks that have sufficient sort of reflective like loopbacks inside them in order to be able to continue that risk mitigation on an ongoing basis in this dynamic world. You know, expectations about what these products need to be achieving are also getting more and more stringent, as well as global circumstances pushing on, you know, how much you may actually be able to achieve in the real world context. So it's all about trying to have the right framework that really captures all of that on a dynamic, ongoing basis.
It's impacting everyone, isn't it? Now every single institution is thinking about protective ways to still continue and create, for instance, on the investor side, Article 9 fund in Europe, but nevertheless make sure that they are not subject to potential allegation of mis-selling. And this in turn is pushing every single organization dealing with them also to have, I don't know, conduct rules internally or committees to review risks and so on. Outside of organization, who is trying to help, and what do you think? What do you think is the role of disclosure? How is it going to help people progress precisely this, if you want, mitigation against the risk of greenwashing, creation of more transparent frameworks? Perhaps, Noeleen, if you could tell us a little bit about the work of the ISSB and what are the challenges faced?
Sure. You know, regulation is everyone's favorite topic, right? And closely behind that is now becoming disclosures. So, you know, we understand, you know, there is so much alphabet soup right now around disclosures, and I think that's the basic way to talk about it. But actually, we all ultimately need to get to a global reporting baseline. And I know we talked about the UK, but for us now, we really need to be globally aligned on this so that we can have, global firms and countries being able to, talk to each other, have comparability, and, create that global standard. And I do believe the ISSB will really help us get there. But there is, an interesting pace at which some of these standards are being developed. Like, I would say faster than some of the previous standards that we've seen, such as even financial reporting. So what we've seen is sort of three standards, right, evolving across the UK. We've got Europe and we've got the US as well. So we've got the ISSB. We know that the UK government have welcomed that. We want that to be a part of our future ESG reporting requirements. We've got now proposed 13 standards from EFRAG, and that's all about responsible, that's all about developing the European sustainability reporting standards. And then we've got the proposed SEC taxonomy. So there's three, right, already. And we have this global divergence because regionally we have different perspectives on this stuff, and we've all made different commitments. So in the UK, we have committed to be the first net zero or the first climate net zero centre by 2050 for our green economy, and that will drive our regulatory environment. And then you look to Europe, and they've committed to something slightly different, which is more about the just transition. So that's driven out of their EU Fit for 55 commitments, and also they've got a broader commitment to creating a social impact fund. So that's them looking more broad from the E and to the S. So naturally, that then does create divergence, but we also have similarities. So it's not all a negative story about disclosures, which people talk about. We do have the TCFD frameworks that are really helping drive commonality here, which is really quite helpful. But there are some challenges, right? And if I just touch on three today, so the audience, the scope, and the level of granularity. So with the audience, right, we've got the ISSB and the SEC commitments. Their climate proposals are very much focused on the investors, whereas if we look at the EFRAG, their reporting standards have a much broader multi-purpose stakeholder view. Then we go to the scope. We diverge again here slightly because ISSB and EFRAG, we really look at a broader range of sustainability challenges and opportunities, but the SEC is climate focused only. And then again, when it comes to the level of granularity, ISSB, SEC have only released draft requirements, where once again, EFRAG have gone that little bit further and have released much more detail around the broader sustainability impacts. This creates a number of practical challenges for companies out there. So, namely, those who have global jurisdictions, who have operations and investors having to repeat this work multiple locations over, and also explain the differences in what they're reporting. There's also divergence with regards to when and where this information should be published. And again, I think the ISSB have got a good view on this in saying they believe that information should be prepared alongside and released on the same terms as your annual reports. And that really will help ensure consistency and integration into the core financial audits. So I think where we'll get to in the next, 5 to 10 years, we will see pressure for convergence from firms, and the emergence of recognition of multiple different standards across the jurisdictions, in the same way that we did see that with financial accounting and reporting over time. But for us at the moment, I really think the key challenge the ISSB is going to have in convening all of us and trying to get us to globally aligned. And, it's all about how we lean into it and lean into the consultation process and really try and minimize the amount of divergence in the future.
Thank you. We start having some questions coming in, so I'm going to ask Simon to start with. Does globalization make it harder to tackle climate change? What is the role for financial and professional services? Your institution obviously has a global remit, so it's not just about the UK or Europe here. What can you tell us about how the private sector can do to help actually with this kind of nightmarish situation of dealing with regulation?
Thank you. That's a fascinating set of questions. Let's try and unpick some of that. So I think we're in a position in which we can acknowledge that globalization has been net positive, but not evenly distributed. And I think that's the challenge to deal with, is a more equitable distribution of the benefits of globalization. In consequence of that, we've all sat in a situation in which we're lucky we've sort of offshored our carbon footprint. The real economy has moved and shifted its centre of gravity. That's been supported by trade and finance flows, but it means that the UK's carbon footprint has decreased partly because the UK has sought to decarbonise its primary sources of energy, but also because actually some of the demand side for that energy has moved elsewhere. And so I think as we try and think about that, we start to find why perhaps there's been an upswing in discussion on just transition as well. As we start to think about climate, we start to think about the impact of globalisation. We can't just reverse that. We can't just suddenly sort of pull up the drawbridge and solve for any particular market's or territory's own decarbonisation challenge. I think it's about trying to think holistically. And again, Noeleen, you've just spoken about perhaps some of the philosophical differences in Europe versus the UK and the US, but I think we start to see that in national and regional responses to tackling the climate emergency. But I think it has to be deeply rooted, and that's where, of course, you see a lot of discussion around carbon taxes as being a mechanism. And as an economist, I always feel slightly conflicted because they feel like they're a very, very sensible solution, but we know that there's a lot of very sensible things that don't get implemented well. But they start to build into the mechanism of global trade and global financial flows a means through which you can recognise that the carbon footprint is distributed. But I think overall it's a complex problem. And one of the things that we were just discussing this on the way to the stage, but is I'm heartened as someone that's worked in this space for some time to see growing public awareness of things like just transition, loss and damage, the importance of adaptation and mitigation. I think the challenge we face is twofold though. One, we're not making the necessary progress on decarbonisation. As we've said already, emissions are shooting back up again, as we re-emerge from pandemic and lockdown. And there is a very real risk that we make climate action more complex by layering on these concepts, by layering on loss and damage, just transition and adaptation. We make it harder and harder for people to actually keep an eye on that primary goal, which is how do we drive those carbon emissions down in that systematic and yet agile way.
There's actually a very good question about whether the industry is attracting the right people to help address the challenges of net zero and seize the opportunities. And with the risk that other industries actually are going to beat the financial services into this. Bryony, do you have any immediate response to that?
Attracting the right people. I mean, I think we understand that there's still a skills gap in financial services and also in professional services. We're having to upskill very, very quickly. And even when you get to a level of skill, I'm sure everybody in this room who works on sustainability in any respect feels this, by the following week, you need to have learned 50 more things in order to still remain, at the kind of forefront of what's going on. So it's a very, very fast moving environment. And in that context, you need very highly skilled but adaptable people in key roles. And that is still happening. People are still building out those teams. People are still creating the skills programs that are needed in order to achieve this. But one of the interesting parts of the previous question that I think is related was about the role of professional services potentially in this kind of globalization challenge, and a little bit about what Noeleen was saying about, the kind of the mandatory frameworks, the hard frameworks are evolving with differences. Well, I think one of the roles of professional services firms and obviously highly skilled people in the industry is to create connectivity in a softer way that sits sort of below that mandatory framework differential. Because across organizations in professional services, my firm is a large global international law firm with offices in multiple countries. As we roll out projects and transactions and kind of regulatory analysis projects across the world, we're implementing a more standardized process because it's a single organization and as you take on that process, you do create a soft alignment, even where the mandatory frameworks are obviously differentiated. So the way in which things are approached can be, I think, assisted with sort of more standardisation via some of the professional services skills. But yeah, there's definitely still, you know, a lot of upskilling, a lot of skills gap, and needing to bring many more people around this.
Well, when we think about it, there is not so many comparable industries with such rapid adoption of innovation. And if you look at the scale, for instance, of the growth of the green bond market in an exponential way, when you think about it, you know, in the 30th past year, there was the fourth industrial revolution with the digital revolution, mobiles, the adoption of mobiles. But this has requested and required a different way of thinking, dealing with the innovation as a very, in a very quick way, sometimes leapfrogging some frameworks and industries. So thinking differently. What do you think, Joseph, that actually governments and regulators can do to help that, to give more incentive to that part of actually the transition? Less the regulation controlling part, but more, you know, unleashing innovation.
Impetus. That's a good question. I mean, in a sense, at its most basic level, I mean, I think, you know, what does every market need to price risk and opportunity well, right? They need reliable data and metrics of the problem, and regulation that is proportionate and based on those. I mean, on the data and the metrics piece, you know, we have this plethora of data that's been built over the last century on measuring so many sorts of economic risk, right? Statisticians go away and produce GDP statistics. Accountants produce and are then able to audit reliable corporate earnings figures. Wouldn't it be great if we had a GDP for flooding or drought risk or something like that, right? That let you compare it across countries when you were gauging an investment. It's very difficult at the moment to properly gauge firms' transition risks. I know there's enormous efforts underway through the organisation that Simon chairs, through the ISSB, through the FSB that I used to work for, etc. One particular issue there is that, you know, we can all get behind, I think these days we can nearly all get behind the idea that emissions need to fall to net zero by 2050. Tick, right, at a global level, fine. Emissions aren't always a great guide to risk at the level of individual firms, right? So it's very easy for an investor at the moment to reduce their risk and be net zero aligned by putting all their money in a technology firm, right? Not necessarily doing much to help decarbonize the global economy. In fact, if that technology firm is, for example, selling software to the oil and gas industry, then it might be that by doing that, they've actually increased their local individual transition risk as well, because that firm's customer base is going to evaporate or at least radically change over the next 30 years. So it's very easy to decarbonize on paper at the moment, but that doesn't necessarily translate to a reduction in, you know, your risks as an investor or the risks to the global economy. To be fair, there'll always be a need to divest certain assets, but there's also this role for stewardship, right, for supporting firms' transition plans and investing in technology. A very quick anecdote, Delphine, I'll do this in 30 seconds. So we had a very interesting conversation with a firm, one of the US's biggest manufacturers of American cheese, right, based in Texas, run by two brothers called Dick and Randy. And we said, you know, decarbonisation, climate risk, what do you think? We don't need to worry, they said, because God is warming the planet. And who are we to stand in the face of God and worry about this thing called global warming that's taking place on a global level? So we said, listen, Dick, if you carry on like this, McDonald's is no longer going to buy your cheese. Now a big client, right? So there's a way of getting through, well, there's a way of getting through to everyone, right? And there's this distinction between the amount that you're emitting and the risk to your business and your supply chain.
Thank you. I think maybe it would be a good time to look at the poll, perhaps, and sort of comment on it. So we asked, what are the two main barriers to action? for financial services firms getting involved in green financial products. So it looks like...
Looks like we got 3.
Yeah, it's moving.
Oh, there we go.
It's kind of interesting. So we'll just give it 10 seconds to make sure that people have voted and not changing their mind. But I'd like the panel to react on that, actually. Does it surprise you, Simon?
I find it interesting because there's been a lot of pushback against taxonomy and other frameworks. So my first reaction is, wow, okay, people still love the taxonomy. Great. It's interesting as well, because when we were talking about greenwashing earlier, if you look at social anthropology, there's a branch of study called cross-cultural communication, and I always think about greenwashing in that context, and I thought your remarks were excellent, which is there's a party making the communication, there's a party receiving the communication, and to my mind, greenwashing is a mismatch between the two. Now, it would be very arrogant to sit here and go, well, it's never the financial institution's fault, it's always the client's fault, and I don't think that's right, but it is just trying to understand both parties' standing perspective, and I think in a way that picks up as well on the discussion earlier that we were having about how do you upskill staff, because I think we've moved into a very different space now. If you go back 5 or 10 years, you opened a dusty broom cupboard somewhere and your sustainability team was in there and they did their own stuff and they had a huge amount of autonomy. They could do whatever they wanted because it wouldn't impact the firm. And now firms are making net zero commitments, they're making biodiversity commitments, they're making social pledges, and these are strategic to organisations. But to get those done, you no longer need to turn to the sustainability team in that dusty broom cupboard. It needs to be your C-suite, it needs to be your board, but it also needs to be people throughout the organisation. And I think as we're equipping and upskilling organisations, it's about how do you give everyone the expertise they need, because today you can go into an organisation, you can find 2 people with climate in their job title, and one of them is someone who was there in the broom cupboard, and someone else is someone who was a quant data modeler on something in financial markets 6 months ago, and is now helping with climate data transformation. They're going to need and they're going to have very different skill sets. So I think it's about how you, in particular, how do you transition to the right stage of institutional maturity? But frankly, we're also going to have a problem before too long, like we all did with financial crime compliance, where headcount went like that, costs went like that, and then we got the right organisational model. Is how do we prepare for actually the target operating model once we've got through that curve? What's the right resourcing model? Because this is going to go up and then it's going to go back down again. And I think we've got to think as organisations, how do you sensibly manage that so that everyone has a good sense of where you're getting to? Because you're not just going to solve this by putting more people to the problem.
The role of technology is really key. I mean, you've just mentioned it, but also, the way that we need to be able to accommodate for evolving technology solutions alongside the challenges around net zero. And one of the other priorities that I have been working on is how to help fintech develop better ESG credentials itself. And there are these surrounding challenges that you've already got tech transition before you got net zero transition, and now you've got combined tech and net zero transition happening at the same time. And so obviously it's a complex framework, but then there's a lot of promise, I think, in that technology in terms of solutions, certainly around data, data challenges that you've mentioned. But I'd really like to see that come through in a much more integrated way, including around, the opportunities of conferences like this, where we can try to bring actually those tech. I mean, none of us are from a directly tech organisation, and it would be actually interesting to try to combine a bit more of that into these net zero panels. I feel important topic.
So maybe because I can see we're getting towards the end of our session, in 2 words, how would you feel about this net zero transition and the contribution of your institution? Do you want to start, Josh?
In 2 words.
Well, 2 sentences.
I'll stick with cautiously optimistic.
Cautiously optimistic.
With a need for pragmatism.
Bryony, you can have 2 sentences.
Okay. Well, I was going to go with focus and motivate. Yeah. 2 words.
I think we're in a situation where we're all driving a car at 80 miles an hour and changing the tyres at the same time. But the positivity is there's people in the car and there's willing.
Yeah.
Very little for me to add. I'd agree with all of that sentiment.
Thank you. No, I hope we've given a little bit of hope, because it's common, language these days to be overwhelmed by the task and regulation issues and so on. But you can see, from very different perspectives of of different institutions working in the financial sector and helping the financial sector contribute. Clearly, there are lots of people at work. It's a collective effort. There is some tactical work to be done right now, given the geopolitical situation, but there's a strategy, at least, is clear, and there is a lot of work to do, but it's also quite exciting, isn't it? So thank you very much, everyone, for contributing, and thanks for the audience, because we had some really good questions. Thank you.